I don't know why we need God to zap people. I say that, and I know people living today need zaps. But honestly, they feel like they're not walking with God unless they get zapped. I'm not going to name any names, but you know what I'm talking about.
How does Jesus' parable with Lazarus and the rich man apply to this? Is that something separate from the Old Testament?
I would not use the word separate. I would use the word more detailed. What you see is when you have the Old Testament, at a given point the Old Testament period ends. And then naturally people within Judaism are doing what we do. They're writing about their Bible, like producing commentaries and things like that. And a lot of that literature speculates on what's the place like? What goes on down there? And eventually you get fuller descriptions, you get more details, you get persons on either side. Like there's the side that, in Sheol that, Abraham can sort of look at where it is. He's safe, but he can look down, look over into this place. And in that particular instance, there's a very clear idea of fiery punishment. There's only one. You don't really get fiery punishment in the Old Testament. What you do get, though, is Sheol was a fearful place because of who was there. And there are some sinister characters there. It's described as watery. There's one passage that talks about, it mentions flame, but the question is whether it's like a burning place or not. But there are demonic, bad entities there. It's a fearful place to be. So it's definitely cast as the place that God isn't and that the bad things are. But you don't get the full descriptions of punishment. You get that on into the intertestamental period, and then the New Testament is very consistent with that. So you actually have, I'm going to use the double D word, doctrinal development, okay, for the doctrine of the afterlife. And before that scares you, all doctrines develop. Okay, I challenge you to find a doctrine, a biblical doctrine, that isn't different in some way between the testaments. They're never exactly the same. They progress. We believe in something called progressive revelation. You say, oh, those books in the middle, those intertestamental books, they're not part of Revelation. No, they're not. But the writers on either side, especially the New Testament writers, they're reading these. Okay, they quote some of them in the New Testament. New Testament quotes some non-canonical sources to make a theological point because they're thinking about what they're doing. Now, in the doctrine of inspiration, we say that God was fine with that. God providentially said, you want to quote that? Fine. It helps. Yeah, you're right. It's a good illustration. You have to view what's going on in a very providential sense. I think you're getting the feel. When it comes to inspiration, I'm just going to say this. We think of inspiration often wrongly. We think of it as an event. Prophet gets up, starts making eggs for breakfast. His mind blanks out and his hand starts to move, and he's not conscious of this at all. He wakes up and goes, wow, that's pretty cool. I didn't know I could do that. That is not inspiration. Inspiration ought to be viewed more like canonicity, a long, providentially guided process that took as long as God wanted it to take. And in the end, God looked at it and said, good job. Thumbs up. You got it. Okay, it's not zapping, all right? It's not automatic writing like it's a paranormal experience, okay? It's a long developing process where God is in the process. He was in the process before the writer was even born. He's preparing the environment into which that writer will be born. He's preparing the parents. He's preparing the education. He's preparing everything about that guy or that collection of guys ahead of time. He sees all that because at the end of the trail, God wants to look at it and say, you got it. Now from this point on, just start copying it. No changes. We're done. Just copy the thing now. And then again, that sets up its own set of circumstances. We have to get away from this cartoonish idea of inspiration. And doctrinal development is one of those. God says, there's an afterlife. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. Come on, psalmist, cough it up, start writing. He writes down, again, what he understands of it. God says, okay, that'll do. Good enough for now. Time goes on. We're out of the Old Testament period. You got a lot of Jewish writers speculating on things. New Testament period comes along. Peter wants to write something about the underworld or the afterlife. And he happened to read 5 years ago this book by Philo over here. And God says, that was a pretty good book by Philo. I mean, I didn't really tell him to write it, but it was a good book. Why don't you remember that page? And when you remember that page, put that in. That's a good line. And Peter puts it in. Good job. That'll be clear. Because the whole idea is communication. It's not producing some paranormal artifact. The idea is communication. People under God's hand doing the task, producing something to be preserved for posterity. That's all it is. It's a very, you understand when I say that, it's a very human thing. But God is in the process. I don't know why we need God to zap people. I just don't get it. I say that, and I know people living today need zaps. Because they know, honestly, they feel like they're not walking with God unless they get zapped. I'm not going to name any names. But you know what I'm talking about. Okay. God can't be real unless I'm zapped. Well, actually, he can. If you think a little bigger, he can. I went, sorry for that rabbit trail, but any other questions? That's a hobby horse of mine, I think you can tell. But yes.